I'll never forget that sound. It was a sound that seemed to come from the heart of the earth, deep, metallic, almost alive. I was sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee in my hands, when I first heard it. At that moment, I had no idea that that distant echo would change my life, and the lives of 500 other people, forever. The sky over Ashland was shrouded in a thick fog, and the wind carried a strange omen, as if the world were holding its breath. The town was small and quiet, the kind where the biggest event of the month was the church bell ringing on Sundays. But that afternoon, something was different. I could feel it. People say that God speaks through silence, but on that day he spoke through a sound, the sound of a train. What no one knew was that that train, carrying entire families, the elderly, children, and workers, had lost control miles away. I remember closing my eyes for a moment, trying to make out what I was hearing. Something was wrong. The rhythm of the tracks wasn't the same. It was like a heart beating too fast, out of sync. At that instant, a sensation ran down my spine, and the sound seemed to get closer and closer. That's when I realized there was someone on the sidewalk, standing motionless, with their head slightly tilted to the side, as if they were hearing something that no one else could hear. It was Ethan, the blind boy who lived 2 houses down from mine. Ethan was 12 years old and had a shy smile that could melt any heart. Since the accident that took his sight, he had developed an almost mystical relationship with sound. They said he could hear a bird's wings beating a block away. That afternoon, he stood in front of his front gate, his ears perked, his face turned toward nothing, or perhaps toward everything. He seemed hypnotized by something only he could feel. Before continuing, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all his infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, because we can never lose faith in God, for he will never abandon us, because his love is eternal and infinite. I also take this opportunity to ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot, thank you. Looking back to that afternoon, I remember the sound of the church bells mingling with a distant metallic clang. Ethan turned his head, as if trying to pinpoint the exact source of the noise. His mother, Sarah, was calling him from the window, but he didn't answer. It was as if he were in a trance. The first thing that caught my attention was his expression, calm but tense, as if he knew something that we, the clairvoyants, were unable to perceive. I asked if everything was all right, and he just murmured, "The train is on the wrong track." At that moment, a shiver ran through my body. Was the train wrong? What did that mean? Ashland had always been proud of its railway line, a symbol of progress and safety. A mistake on the train seemed unthinkable. But the sound didn't lie. Gradually, everyone on the street began to notice that something was different. The engine noise was heavier, irregular, almost painful, as if the machine itself were crying out for help. Sarah hurried downstairs, holding her son's arm, trying to pull him inside. But he resisted. "Mommy, listen. Can't you hear? He's coming too fast." She tried to laugh, thinking it was her imagination. But I saw the fear in her eyes. It was then that the station bell rang 3 times, an emergency signal. That sound was unusual. It was only used in critical situations. Windows began to open, people rushed out into the street, looking towards the tracks. Ethan, still motionless, whispered something that chilled me to the bone, "They won't be able to stop it." And before anyone could ask what he meant, a second sound echoed, a metallic roar, as if the train itself were screaming in pain. The following minutes were a mixture of confusion and fear. Men rushed to the station's radio, but communication was cut off. No one knew what was happening. Only Ethan continued listening, analyzing, as if each vibration told a story. "It's 20 miles, maybe less," he said quietly. How could he know? No one there believed him. But when the ground began to shake, everyone realized he was right. The air smelled of iron and electricity. The leaves of the trees vibrated, and even the dogs began to bark incessantly. Sarah hugged him desperately, trying to pull him inside, but he broke free, running to the fence. "There are children on that train," he said. "I can hear them." Those words pierced me like an arrow. The boy was really hearing something, voices, perhaps screams, echoes carried by the wind from afar. As panic gripped the city, Ethan knelt on the ground, pressing his ear to the earth. He lay there for long seconds, motionless, as if conversing with the ground. Then he raised his head and said, "The brakes aren't working." At that moment, no one doubted it anymore. The station radio confirmed it. Train 417 was out of control, speeding towards the valley. There were 500 people on board. The sirens started blaring, but there wasn't much I could do. The train driver wasn't responding, and the train was getting closer and closer. People were screaming, some were crying. I had never felt so scared. Ethan, however, seemed calm. He turned to his mother and said, "I can help." Sarah was crying, begging him to stay. "You're just a child." But there was something in her tone, a certainty that didn't match her age. The sound grew louder and louder, like a never-ending thunderclap. And then, for the first time, I understood what he meant. The train was truly wrong. The rhythm of the tracks, the sound of the engine, everything screamed despair. Something terrible was about to happen, and that boy seemed to be the only one who could heed the warning before it was too late. I looked at him, and at that moment I had the strange feeling that the fate of all of us depended on what that boy would do next. And then the wind blew again, bringing with it the sharp sound of metal against metal. Ethan lifted his face and said, in a low voice, "Now it has begun." And that's when the chaos really started to take shape. I've known Ethan since he was a baby. He always had a special sparkle in his eyes, even before he lost his sight. When the accident happened, many thought that would be the end of his joy. But somehow, that's when something divine began to blossom. The accident happened on a cold January morning. The car he was in with his father skidded on the icy road and crashed into a tree. His father died instantly. Ethan survived, but lost his sight completely. It was a miracle and a lasting wound. 4 months, the entire city followed Sarah's suffering. She was a nurse and spent sleepless nights by her son's side, praying, asking God for strength not to break down. And somehow, even blind, the child seemed calmer than she was. I remember the day he came home. His face was covered in small scars, but his smile was the same. The first thing he did was ask to hear the bird song. "I want to know if they're still here," he said, with a sweetness that made me choke up. Over time, Ethan began to perceive the world in a different way. He heard the leaves rustling, people's footsteps, the sound of rain hitting the roof as if they were musical notes. It was as if the universe had decided to speak directly to him. Sarah taught him to walk using a cane, but he rarely used it. He said the sounds of the street were enough. "The world sings, Mom. We just need to listen." She laughed, but inside she cried. This was more than poetry, it was survival. Gradually, the townspeople began to notice that the boy had a gift. He could identify who was arriving just by the sound of their footsteps. He knew when a car had a problem just by listening to the engine. It was impressive. But not everyone believed it was a gift. Some said it was his imagination, that he was just guessing and getting lucky. Until one day he proved everyone right, and I was there to see it. It was a sunny afternoon, and a dog had escaped from Mrs. Parker's yard. Everyone was searching desperately, until Ethan, sitting on the porch step, pointed and said, "He's trapped behind the shed." And he was. From then on, no one doubted him anymore. The whole city began to see the boy with a mixture of admiration and reverence. Some even said he was blessed. Others, that he was too strange. But everyone knew he was special. Ethan, however, never considered himself different. "I just hear better," he would say simply. "God took one thing away, but gave me another." That phrase stuck with me. Over the years, his sensitivity increased. He said he could even hear the sound of the clouds moving before the rain. Sarah found it amusing, but I saw a hint of fear in her eyes, as if she sensed that this gift would one day bring danger. And he brought it. It all started weeks before the train disaster. Ethan began waking up in the middle of the night, sweating profusely, saying he heard metallic screams. Sarah thought they were nightmares, but he swore it was real. One morning, he told me something that gave me the creeps. "The train is going to get hurt." I laughed, thinking it was just a child's imagination. But he became serious. "It's sick. I can hear it." At that moment, I realized the boy was hearing something none of us could understand. Perhaps vibrations, perhaps the sound of a mechanical failure, or perhaps something more spiritual. I couldn't explain it. A week later, he began walking to the station alone. He would stop near the tracks and stand in silence, just listening. Sometimes he would stay there for hours, as if he were conversing with the train itself. The station master, Mr. Miller, even joked with him, "Are you listening to secrets from the tracks, boy?" Ethan just smiled and replied, "They're asking for help." Miller was embarrassed. I tried to ignore it, but something in his voice unsettled me. There was truth there. Truth and fear. As if the boy was receiving a warning that no one else could grasp. That week, Sarah confided in me that she was worried. "He doesn't sleep well. He keeps saying the train is going to break down. That it's going to hurt a lot of people." I tried to reassure her, but something inside me told me we should listen to him. Then came the day the sound changed. Ethan woke up early, went downstairs, and headed straight for the backyard. He pressed his ear to the ground and lay there motionless for several minutes. When he stood up, he looked frightened. "The sound is gone, Mr. Thomas. Gone, and that's bad." He said this with tears in his eyes, even though he couldn't see. I didn't understand at the time, but later I realized, silence also speaks. The next day, the alarms started. Train 417 left Denver and never managed to stop again. What happened next became the region's biggest rail disaster, and the most inexplicable miracle Ashland had ever witnessed. When the sound of the train began to echo through the city, Ethan already knew what was happening. He felt it, he heard it, he anticipated it. While everyone ran for shelter, he stood firm, listening intently. And it was at that moment that I realized he didn't see the world as we did. He listened to it with his heart. Every vibration, every note, every echo. Everything spoke to him. And that afternoon, the world screamed louder than ever. I saw him lift his face to heaven, his lips moving in prayer. "Lord, show me what to do." It was the first time I had seen faith and fear coexist in the same gaze. The train was coming. And Ethan seemed ready for something none of us would fully understand. The sound grew louder, the ground trembled, and the entire city braced for the worst. But the boy, motionless, seemed to see, with his soul, what was yet to come. And when the wind blew strongly, carrying with it the sound of metal in despair, he smiled slightly and murmured, "I know what I need to do." And that's how everything started to change. The next day, the wind seemed different. It blew with a strange force, carrying the smell of iron and smoke, even though there was no train in sight. It was as if the air was bringing a warning. And somehow, Ethan sensed it before all of us. I found him early, sitting on the porch step, his head slightly tilted, as if listening to a distant melody. "Are you hearing anything new?" I asked. He replied with a slight smile, "The wind is speaking." Sarah appeared soon after, bringing a cup of tea. "Son, you need to rest." But Ethan shook his head, as if he were somewhere else. "Mom, the wind isn't happy today." His words sent a chill down my spine. Even though he was just a boy, there was an authority in his voice. As if all of nature whispered secrets that only he could understand. Sarah tried to change the subject, but Ethan seemed to know that something was about to happen. Later, in the city, people began to comment on strange noises on the tracks. A high-pitched sound, like metal scraping. The station master sent a team to investigate, but nothing was found. Everything seemed normal, until the wind changed direction. Ethan, however, knew. He spent the whole day restless, pacing back and forth, listening. At night, when everyone was asleep, I found him in front of the house, his eyes staring blankly into space. "He's screaming," he said. "Who's yelling, Ethan?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He took a deep breath. "The train." Those two words kept echoing in my head like an unfading echo. The next day, the sound of the trails seemed more intense. Even those who didn't believe it began to notice. The wind carried a constant, almost suffocating, metallic hum. It was as if the entire air vibrated with pain. The local pastor, Mr. Williams, said during Sunday's sermon that perhaps it was God trying to warn us about something bigger. Most laughed. But Ethan, sitting in the last pew, just lowered his head. After Mass, he called me aside and whispered, "If the sound gets worse, no one will have time to run." I swallowed hard. "Run from what, Ethan?" He simply replied, From fate. Those words echoed inside me for the rest of the day. Sarah tried to convince him to stay home, but he insisted on going to the tracks. I need to listen closely. There was a determined glint in his face, a glint that unsettled me. I went with him. We walked side by side along the dirt road to the point where the railway track cut through the valley. The wind was blowing hard, kicking up dust. Ethan stopped, pressed his ear to the metal, and remained completely still. For a few seconds, the whole world seemed suspended. Then he stood up, his face pale. "They won't be able to stop us." The way he said it, it didn't sound like a guess. It sounded like certainty. I tried to ask more, but he was already walking back, murmuring a prayer. It was the first time I heard him say, "Lord, don't let it happen again." Again. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. Later, Sarah told me that he had been having the same dream repeatedly. An out-of-control train, a distant scream, and a deafening sound of metal against metal. It always ended in silence, and tears on his face. The mothers in town said he was too sensitive. But Sarah knew he was more than that. She would see him wake up in the middle of the night, his hands over his ears, crying, as if the sound of the nightmare still echoed inside him. One afternoon, she called me for help. Ethan was trembling, sitting on the kitchen floor. "It's coming faster," he repeated weakly. "The sound is closer." I tried to calm him down, saying that the train came every day at the same time, but he shook his head. "It's not the usual train. This one is sick. It's bleeding from the inside." That sent chills down my spine. Days later, the local newspaper announced that train 417, the longest on the line, would be making its test run with passengers. It would be the first trip without the old steam brake system. Sarah read the news and turned pale. Ethan just murmured, "It's him." The wind that week was relentless. It howled night and day, as if carrying a message no one wanted to hear. And each time it blew harder, Ethan grew more restless. One morning, I found him in front of the church, eyes closed and hands outstretched. "The wind is trying to warn you, Mr. Thomas. But no one is listening." I asked what the wind was saying. He replied, "It cries for those who are yet to suffer." It was at that moment that I realized it wasn't just a feeling. It was a warning, a calling. Ethan seemed destined for something he didn't even fully understand. When the wind shifted again, blowing northward, he turned and said, "It's too late now." I asked what he meant, but he only whispered, "The gears have already started turning." The next day, communications from the station went down. The radio was malfunctioning, the sensors weren't responding. Train 417 had already left Denver, and no one could make contact. Ethan, hearing the distant sound, simply lowered his head. "It's coming," he said calmly. "And it's angry." People laughed, saying he had too much imagination. But when the ground began to vibrate slightly, even the most skeptical fell silent. I looked at him, trying to understand. "How do you know?" He simply replied, "Because the wind told me." And that afternoon, for the first time, the wind stopped blowing. A profound silence enveloped the city, the kind of silence that comes before the storm. Ethan lifted his face, as if he could see the sky. A single strand of hair swayed across his sweaty forehead. He smiled, with an air of someone who already knew what fate had in store. "It's going to happen today," he said, with an unsettling serenity. "But God has shown me that there is still hope." I asked him what he intended to do. He simply turned his face toward me and replied, "Listen to the end." And at that instant, I felt the first tremor in my feet, as if the heart of the earth were beating with fear. The wind's prophecy was coming true, and no one was prepared for what was to come. When train 417 left Denver that morning, no one imagined what was about to happen. It was a clear day, with the sun reflecting off the tracks like a mirror. Hundreds of passengers boarded smiling, unaware that they were entering a nightmare. The engineer, Mr. Howard, was an experienced man. More than 30 years driving locomotives without a single incident. He greeted each passenger with a calm smile, as if destiny were under his control. But life has mysterious ways of testing our faith. And on that day, God would allow something to slip through human hands to show that there are forces beyond comprehension. The train departed at 8:17 in the morning. Sarah, at home, was preparing coffee, while Ethan, with his eyes closed, whispered a prayer. "It's beginning, Mom." She turned, confused, not understanding what he meant. At 9:10, the radio at Ashland Station began to crackle. The operator tried to adjust the frequency, but only static was heard. He banged on the panel and muttered, "What the hell?" And then, a metallic noise invaded the sound, like the scream of a wounded machine. On the other end of the line, a desperate voice cut through the silence. "Brakes! Failed! We can't slow down." Then, only noise. And silence. Mr. Miller, the station master, turned pale. "Repeat it! Repeat it!" But there was no response. Train 417 was out of control. Meanwhile, Ethan raised his head. "He's running now," he said in a calm but firm voice. Sarah looked at him, her heart racing. "Running? What?" And he replied, "The train. He's scared." That phrase was impossible to comprehend, but within it lay truth. The sound traveled through the earth, vibrating beneath their feet, and even those who didn't want to believe felt something change in the air. Minutes later, the city's sirens began to sound. A warning: train emergency. People ran out of their homes, looking towards the valley. The sound of the train was already audible, a roar that grew louder and louder, arrhythmic, uncontrolled. That noise, it was almost human. A groan of pain mixed with the creaking of metal. The windows trembled, the children cried, and the birds flew in flocks, fleeing north. I remember looking at Ethan. He was serene, standing at the gate, listening intently. "They're trying to stop, but they can't." His voice sounded like an echo of the tragedy itself. Communication was completely lost at 9:23. The train was less than 20 miles from the city, descending a dangerous slope. The engineer applied the emergency brakes, but nothing happened. "Critical speed," one of the controllers said over the radio, before the signal disappeared. Miller looked at me and murmured, "If he crashes on the valley bend, there won't be anyone left." Meanwhile, Ethan walked towards the tracks. Sarah ran after him, shouting his name. "Come back here, Ethan. For God's sake." But the boy remained steadfast, guided only by the sounds. When he got close to the tracks, he stopped and placed his hands on the hot iron. "It's vibrating too much. It's dying." That wasn't a metaphor. He felt the vibrations of the train, as if the rail were a vein pulsing wildly. The crowd gathered near the station, trying to figure out what to do. Some cried, others prayed. No one knew how to help. Ethan, however, seemed to know. "If I listen closer, maybe I can understand what he wants." Sarah tried to stop him, but he knelt down and pressed his ear to the rail again. The wind blew hard, carrying the sound of the disaster. I could hear it too, finally, the rhythmic creaking of the rails, the engine howling like a raging animal. And then I realized the boy had been right all along. The vibration increased with each passing second. The windows began to crack, the floor trembled. And Ethan, amidst that chaos, uttered disjointed phrases. "He's saying, 'The brake doesn't listen anymore.'" Sarah knelt beside him, weeping. "Son, please." But he seemed in a trance, his lips moving in prayer. "Lord, help me to hear properly. Show me what to do." Suddenly, a louder bang shook the earth. One of the power poles near the line fell, sparks flying everywhere. The wind carried the smell of ozone and fear. It was at that moment that the impossible happened. The train appeared in the distance, a steel monster racing uncontrollably around the bend in the valley. Its headlights cut through the fog like furious eyes. People screamed, running away. Sarah collapsed to her knees, and I could only stand there, paralyzed. Ethan, however, stepped forward. I can hear his voice. It was insane. But somehow, he seemed to be communicating with the sound. The train whistled irregularly, and Ethan murmured replies, as if there were an exchange between them. The train driver inside was desperately trying to activate the manual system. One of the passengers would later recount seeing sparks and smoke rising from the panel, while people screamed and prayed. But in Ashland, all we could do was watch that iron giant approaching. The sound was already deafening, the wind hot, the ground trembling. And, in the midst of it all, Ethan reached out his hand. "Lord, if it is your will, Let me hear what no one else can." At that moment, a gust of wind so strong blew that the trees bent. And, for a second, the sound of the train seemed to change, a dissonant note, a plea, a cry. Ethan raised his face and said, "He's asking for help." Sarah hugged him desperately, but he pulled away and ran to the side of the tracks, stumbling but steady. "I need to listen closer," he shouted. The train was already clearly visible. Sparks flew from the tracks, the engine roared. The crowd shouted for him to get out of there. But he didn't hear the fear, only the sound. "It's now," he murmured. "I understand what he means." And then something happened. The sound of the train changed again, as if it had answered. A different hum, deep, constant. Ethan turned his face to me and shouted, "He doesn't want to hurt anyone!" And before I could react, a new burst of steam shook the earth, and the world seemed to freeze. The train was minutes away from collision, and only a miracle could stop it. But at that moment, I swear, something divine began to happen. Ethan, with his eyes closed, reached out his hands toward the sound, and the wind seemed to quiet down to listen to him. It was there that I realized God was about to act, through a blind boy. When the train appeared around the bend, the whole world seemed to stop. The sound was so loud it pierced my chest like an invisible blade. That metallic noise, a mixture of scream and groan, seemed like despair itself transformed into sound. People were screaming, crying, running in all directions. Sarah tried to reach Ethan, but he was already too close to the tracks. The wind whipped up dust and leaves, swirling as if the air had gone mad. "My God, save that boy!" she screamed, between sobs. I ran too, but each step seemed futile. The ground was shaking so much we could barely keep our balance. The sound was deafening, brutal, almost supernatural. Ethan, however, didn't seem afraid. He stood facing the approaching train, his arms outstretched. "I hear them," he shouted. "They're scared too." That phrase, it still echoes in my mind. Them. It was as if he could hear the voices from inside the train, the stifled screams, the panic trapped in the hot iron. It was impossible, and yet true. The train driver struggled against the engine. Inside, the passengers prayed, shouted, and clung to one another. One woman recounted how she held a stranger's hand and began to pray Psalm 91 aloud. Meanwhile, Ethan knelt near the tracks. "Lord, help me understand. Show me what the sound means." The train was already so close that the heat from the engine burned the surrounding air. Sarah screamed his name. "Ethan, come back to me. Please, son." But he seemed in a trance. Tears streamed down his face, and yet there was a strange peace there. Suddenly he raised his head and said, almost in a whisper, "Mom, I can hear Dad." At that moment, everyone around fell silent. Sarah staggered, her face pale. "What did you say, son?" And he, in a trembling voice, replied, "Daddy is teaching me what to do." The sound of the train was approaching, now just a few meters away. The air vibrated. I could feel every beat of the engine in my heart. Everything seemed to dissolve into a single continuous, high-pitched note, like a scream trapped between heaven and earth. Ethan stood slowly, his hair swaying in the warm wind. "I know what the sound means. But I need to get closer." Sarah tried to hold him back, but he pulled away. I remember running after him, feeling the ground tremble as if it were alive. He walked fast, guided only by sound, as if he had invisible eyes. The train was now less than 300 meters away. The driver blew the whistle frantically, trying to warn them, but it was too late. That sound cut through the air like a sword. Ethan stopped. He took a deep breath. And, amidst the chaos, he closed his eyes. The silence within him seemed louder than the noise around him. It was then that he murmured, "It's not a noise, it's a request." That phrase stayed with me forever. A request. I didn't understand it at the time, but something told me he was hearing something beyond the physical, something spiritual, ancestral, perhaps divine. The sound changed again. It became deeper, heavier, as if the train were responding to his presence. It was as if two invisible forces were communicating through the noise. "Lord, guide me," he whispered, putting his hands to his ears. "Don't let anyone die today. Use me if necessary." Sarah fell to her knees, praying aloud, her face wet with tears. Jesus, don't take my son. If he is your instrument, protect him, Lord. The entire city seemed to repeat the same prayer, between sobs and cries. Suddenly, the wind blew with such force that the dust swirled upwards. People ducked, shielding their faces. And, for a moment, the sound of the train seemed distorted, as if someone had tampered with the invisible threads of time. Ethan took a step forward. Just one. Small, but eternal. The sound reacted. The whistle changed. The train roared, vibrating, and a huge crack shook the valley. It seemed as if the whole world had stopped breathing. I saw him smile. A serene smile, full of faith. Now I know what I have to do. Nobody understood. Sarah screamed again. The sirens mingled with the screams of the people, and the noise of the engine grew increasingly desperate. Ethan turned his face toward the train and murmured, "Don't be afraid." It was seconds, maybe less, but I swear I saw something change in the sound. He slowed down, as if the train had actually heard him. A long, deep groan, like a sigh. The ground was still shaking, but there was something new in the air, a feeling of pause, as if the universe were waiting for the next step. Ethan fell to his knees, exhausted, and said, "I can't do it alone." Then he lifted his face to the sky and cried out, "Father, help me!" It was at that exact moment that we heard another sound, a dry bang, like metal breaking. The train began to spark, losing power. The wheels squealed, screaming against the tracks. People applauded, cried, prayed. But Ethan remained motionless, breathing with difficulty. "It's not over yet. There's still more." The train kept coming, but slower. Still fast enough to destroy everything, but different, as if something were holding it back. Sarah hugged him, crying, "You did what you could, my love." But he replied weakly, "No, Mom, there's still one last sound missing." I never understood what he meant at that moment. Only much later, when I learned what was about to happen, did I realize that those words were the prelude to the miracle. The train continued to approach slowly, spewing smoke and flames, and the sound of despair was now mixed with something new, hope. And in the midst of the chaos, Ethan raised his face one last time and said calmly, "The next sound will be God's." And that's when everything changed. After the train began to slow down, everyone thought the worst was over. But inside me, something told me that this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of something much bigger. Ethan was exhausted, kneeling on the floor, but his face had a different expression. It was peace mixed with understanding, as if he had finally heard what he needed to hear. Sarah hugged him, still crying. "It's over, son. You're all right now." But he, with his eyes closed, murmured, "He showed me. I heard everything." Nobody understood. "What did you hear, Ethan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned his face toward me and replied softly, "Dad's sound." At that moment, Sarah froze. Her husband's name hung in the air like a ghost. Mr. Daniel, Ethan's father, had been a railroad engineer, the same one who designed part of the line where that runaway train was now passing. His memory resurfaced like a whirlwind. Daniel was a calm, gentle man, passionate about trains. He spent hours showing his son drawings of the mechanisms, the plans, the gears. "The sound of the engine is like our heart," he used to say. After the accident, Sarah never spoke his name again. It was too painful. But Ethan, even as a child, remembered every word, every sound, every lesson. That afternoon, while the train still roared in the distance, Ethan seemed to remember something. He pulled away from his mother's embrace and walked slowly to the balcony. "I know where his secret is." "What secret, Ethan?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "Dad left a hidden sound." We fell silent. Sarah seemed breathless. "A sound?" He nodded. "On an old tape. He said it was in case one day the train wouldn't hear anyone anymore." That sentence sounded strange and mysterious. But within it lay meaning, the kind of meaning that only a passionate engineer and an attentive son could understand. Sarah ran inside the house, trembling. She climbed the stairs and began rummaging through drawers, boxes, and cupboards. And then, at the bottom of an old wooden box, she found a dusty cassette tape. On the label, just one word written by hand, "Faith." When she came down with the ribbon in her hands, Ethan's expression changed. He stood up, as if he had sensed his father's presence. "He knew this was going to happen," he murmured. We ran to the old tape player in the living room. The device still worked, although with some noise. Sarah put the tape in. A hissing sound filled the room. Then, the voice. It was Daniel. His voice was calm, deep, and full of tenderness. "If you're hearing this, my little Ethan, it's because something has gone wrong. But don't be afraid. The sound can guide you." Sarah covered her mouth, trying to hold back tears. Ethan stood motionless, his hands trembling on his knees. The voice continued, "Remember what I taught you? Each track has a frequency. When the train loses its rhythm, it speaks differently. And the only way to make it stop is to find the right sound." I got goosebumps from head to toe. The man had left, years before, the exact explanation of how to control the emergency system through sound, something that only someone with perfect hearing could identify. "There's a sound code, my son," Daniel said in the recording. "It's like a song that calms the machine's heart. Only someone who truly listens can use it." Sarah broke down in tears. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed in a trance. "Mom, that's it. He trained me without knowing it." The train still echoed in the distance, its deep sound mingling with the wind. Ethan stood and walked to the door. "I know what note it is. I've heard it from the beginning. Son, for God's sake, don't go," Sarah pleaded. But he smiled. "Dad's with me. I just need to play the right sound." We ran after him, but he was already walking down the street, guided only by the sound of the train. The tape player was still playing Daniel's last words. "Ethan, if the sound ever gets too loud, breathe and listen to the silence between the notes. That's where God speaks." That phrase seemed like a prophecy. The sun was beginning to set, tinging the sky orange and red. The train was still coming, slower, but without stopping completely. The city was in prayer. Ethan reached the station, knelt down again, and pressed his ear to the tracks. He remained silent for a few seconds. Then he began to whistle, a high-pitched, clear, almost sacred sound. It was a long, pure note that seemed to come straight from the soul. The wind stopped. The birds fell silent. Even the train seemed to hesitate. "He's responding," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "Dad was right. It's the sound of faith." I had never felt anything so intense. The train began to squeal, releasing smoke, and the roar subsided. It was as if the engine had actually heard that whistle. Sarah was crying, her hands covering her face. I couldn't move a muscle. It was the impossible becoming real before our eyes. Ethan maintained the sound, steady, constant. The train slowed down, little by little, fighting against its own strength. Each spark that jumped from the tracks seemed like a cry of liberation. "Keep going, Ethan," I shouted. And he replied, smiling, "I can hear the sound of heaven now." The air around them grew heavy, hot, vibrant. The wind picked up, bringing with it a chorus of echoes, the sound of the crowd crying, praying, believing. And in that instant, I realized, my father's secret wasn't just a formula. It was faith transformed into sound. It was the love of a father and son transcending time and death to save lives. But the train still hadn't stopped. And what happened next was something no one would ever forget. The sound changed. It became deeper, more erratic. Ethan stopped whistling, his forehead sweating, his body trembling. "Something's wrong. There's another sound coming along." I tried to ask what he meant, but he just whispered, "There's a new voice in the midst of the noise." And then, for the first time, he seemed frightened. "It's not Daddy's sound. It's another sound. A sound that would change everything." The train continued roaring on the horizon, like a heart in despair. But now Ethan was no longer just a boy. He was the link between sound and silence, between life and the divine. After discovering the tape left by his father, Ethan understood the true purpose of the gift he possessed. He didn't hear the world, he felt it. And at that moment, the sound wasn't noise, it was direction. It was a calling. With faith guiding his steps, he walked to the exact point where the track curved into the valley. The wind was blowing strongly, and the echo of the train seemed to whisper his name. Sarah watched him from afar, her hands clasped in prayer. She no longer tried to stop him, she simply trusted. Ethan took a deep breath and began to emit a soft sound, a note reminiscent of the old whistle of steam trains. It was simple, almost imperceptible, but it carried something inexplicable: peace. What followed was something no one could quite explain. The boy's sound mingled with the machine's roar, and a change occurred, first slight, then profound. The metallic noise that once sounded like despair began to transform into harmony. People in Ashland looked at the tracks and saw the impossible, the train slowing down, slowly, as if an invisible force were touching it from within. Some knelt, others wept. It was like witnessing a miracle in real time. Ethan, exhausted, remained motionless, his face turned toward the wind. "He heard it, Mom," he murmured with a tired smile. "The train heard the right sound." When the noise subsided, silence enveloped the city, a silence so pure it seemed sacred. The train had stopped. 500 people were alive. Sarah ran to her son and hugged him as if holding her own miracle. Ethan simply said, "Dad was right. The right sound comes from faith." In the days that followed, the news spread throughout the country. Newspapers, radio stations, even pastors in churches spoke of the boy who heard God through the sound of the train. But in Ashland, nobody called him a hero. They just called him the listening boy. The government sent engineers to investigate. No technical explanation was found. The braking system shouldn't have responded. But it did. One of the inspectors summed it all up by saying, "Perhaps there are sounds that only the heart understands." Months later, the station installed a bronze plaque with a simple inscription. Here, a blind boy heard the sound of faith and saved 500 lives. Ethan grew up, but he never sought fame. He continued living quietly with Sarah, always attentive to the sound of the wind, the birdsong, and the silent melody of life. Once, when I asked him what he had actually heard that day, he smiled and replied, "It wasn't the train, Mr. Thomas. It was God teaching me to listen to love." And that's when I understood.